Nelson Mandela was elected to the presidency of South Africa. And that's the Africa I was interested in. That's the Africa I was exploring. Even though right next door at the same time that Nelson Mandela was finding his way from prison to the presidency, Rwanda was being engulfed in a conflagration of unimaginable proportions in what we now know as the Rwandan genocide. But to be honest, that wasn't the Africa I really wanted to know anything about. I was doing field work in West Africa, in Senegal in particular, and I dealt with some conflict issues, but it was really kind of local scale conflict issues. I was interested in how local communities, like herding and farming communities, sort of manage their small scale conflicts, how they manage to create institutions of self-governance and create lives together. But at some point, students started asking me in the classroom about Rwanda and about some of these other conflicts that I was really unfamiliar with. And I finally decided that if I was going to be a serious student of Africa, I needed to know about Rwanda as well. I needed to know about some of the darker subjects that come out of the African continent. And so I did. I started reading about them. I started teaching about them. And it really was, in some respects, importantly, student-driven. And it's led me now to where my focus really is. My consultancy in Cote d'Ivoire was mapping an atrocious conflict that took place there and trying to get a sense of what the impact of 10 years of on-again, off-again civil wars meant for women, children, and vulnerable populations. So all of this is to say that I'm sort of new to the conversation. I've only been doing it about 5 or 6 years, but it has come to matter a great deal to me, and I hope that you find tonight our discussion of the ethics, law, and politics of humanitarian intervention of some interest to you. And I hope you will again ask questions, raise your hand, or chat in when you're ready. Now we all know about the Rwandan genocide, or at least we know that we've got some familiarity with it. But I would begin our discussion with just a few comments about the first genocide of the 20th century that took place in the Darfur region of the Sudan. And I think the reason I mention this is that my students in 2006 in the senior seminar on African politics demanded of me the opportunity to do something philanthropic about the genocide that was taking place in Darfur. They were so compelled by what they were learning about Darfur that they felt that they really needed to incorporate into my senior seminar some element of engagement. And so I was a little hesitant. It wasn't part of my teaching plan. But what I offered in exchange was that if they were going to do this, especially if they were going to do a philanthropic sort of event, I wanted them to bring those who would interrogate philanthropy in a critical way. And they did brilliantly. And I learned a great deal about the complications of how we might intervene into complex humanitarian disasters like the first genocide of the 21st century. What you're seeing now is what the Darfur genocide looks like from satellites. This is the remains of the village of Sidir after it was attacked in November of 2006. Sidir was a large village by Darfur standards. It was home to about 300 families. None live today in Sidir. The village was completely wiped out. Those who survived have left. None have returned. And what you see in this picture are the burnt-out remains of an attack by the Janjaweed militia, that militia group that's been organized and funded by the government in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. The Darfur genocide has been significant by any standards. There are an estimated some 300,000 civilians who perished since the genocide, since the conflict began in 2003. There are approximately 300,000 refugees presiding in refugee camps in neighboring Chad, and I should mention that the refugee status is a horrific one. It is truly living on the edge of subsistence. Now, they do have often protection by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, but this is a very, very precarious existence. So some 300,000 live in Chad. And worse than a refugee status are the 3 million internally displaced persons living presently within the Sudan without the protections even of a United Nations agency. As it has been said by others, IDPs, internally displaced persons, are truly the world's forsaken people, and there are some estimated 2.7 to 3 million of them in Sudan today. There's a total of almost 5 million conflict-affected persons in the Sudan in need presently of humanitarian assistance, of grave humanitarian assistance. And indeed, I wish I could say that this were the worst humanitarian disaster facing the world today, but that's in fact not the case. That title might probably go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which we'll perhaps talk about a little later. So what did we do about it? What have we done about this enormous disaster that is the Darfur complex emergency? Well, in 2004, sitting President George Bush declared that what was going on in the Darfur region was in fact genocide. Now, this was the first time a U.S. president actually declared an ongoing event genocide. And the reason that's significant is because international law stipulates that there are responsibilities to act in the face of genocide. So it was quite significant that the United States was sort of leading the charge here by naming these horrific events genocide. A UN panel found differently, however, and discovered after their analysis that there was inadequate inadequate evidence to support the claim of genocide, though there were in fact acts of genocide that had been perpetrated by the government-sponsored Janjaweed, as well as, I should add, government forces themselves, the Air Force in particular. In response to all of this, there was an absolute enormous worldwide outcry for action in response to these atrocities. The Save Darfur campaign was the sort of spearhead of that large international outcry. But the reality is that the formal international response to that outcry remained quite minimal. In 2004, the African Union mission, AMIS as it's called, was deployed to the region, and the reality is that the African Union mission had no chance of trying to protect the endangered populations of Darfur. It was woefully underfunded. It arrived, if you can believe this, it arrived in Darfur with 150 troops. Sudan is the largest country in Africa, and Darfur is a region of the Sudan about the size of Texas. So arriving with 150 soldiers was pitiable, to say the least. So it's an underfunded mandate, operation. It was undermandated and logistically overwhelmed. And so the first effort, the African Union organized effort, was an abject failure. It was replaced in 2007 by a joint force, the African Union and United Nations mission known as UNAMID. However, it too was underfunded, undermandated, and logistically overwhelmed. In fact, just today, 3 Senegalese peacekeepers, 3 Senegalese members of the UNAMID force were killed in an ambush as they were escorting civilians to a water depot. As the Save Darfur campaign has said, to this day, the operation remains without the resources to protect the 2.7 million internally displaced persons who live in large camps across Darfur. Oh, and I think we have a question. So let me see what we have. And the question is from Adam Kennedy, and he asks, how did the UN panel justify the distinction between acts of genocide and genocide? Can one truly be distinguished from the other? Thanks, Adam. You know, Adam, that's a really complicated question, and it goes to judgment calls. In fact, I think there's enormous resistance to labeling something genocide because of the presence of the Genocide Convention and the obligations that inhere. There's also something about genocide that infers a certain level of scale and intentionality. So one could argue that, as the United Nations panel did, that there were isolated incidents committed by isolated bands of Janjaweed militias that perpetrated acts that, if they were a part of a larger scheme, if they were a part of a larger intentional scheme, would in fact constitute genocide. But they, not having the evidence to indicate that this was a coordinated effort, they were left with the conclusion that acts of genocide were perpetrated. It left many people, as it might have left you, Adam, with quite a sour taste in their mouth. And this is not the first time this distinction has been made. The first time I recall this being made was during the Rwandan genocide, when U.S. State Department spokesperson was being questioned about what was taking place in Rwanda, and she said in response, well, no, there's no genocide. There might be certain acts of genocide having been declared, and she got the very same kind of question that Adam, you just posed. So it goes to judgment call, it goes to scale and coordination and intentionality. So it's a tough question. I think there's another question. Kylie Moore has asked, was there a political gain for President Bush to declare a genocide? That's an excellent question. In some sense, he might have been responding to some very serious domestic pressures that have been building over the course of his presidency, coming from actually the Christian, sort of what we used to call the Christian coalition, or the Christian conservative movement, because the Darfur conflict is not the only conflict that's been present in the Sudan. Actually, there have been two separate civil wars. A separate civil war between the North and the South has been characterized as an Arab-Muslim North against a black Southern African Christian South. As a result of the atrocities committed in that civil war, the Christian conservative movements in this country were lobbying quite vociferously again for the Bush administration to act on that, and they did, in fact. And the Bush administration really took the lead in helping bring about an end to that conflict and helped negotiate the comprehensive agreement that was concluded in 2006. As a result of that involvement, and this is sort of my take on things, as a result of that involvement, it became impossible for them to ignore what started to take place in 2003 in the Darfur region. So I think there was a sort of backdoor obligation to respond to Darfur in the way that he did. I don't think he gained personally in any particular way, any sort of gained any political capital out of it. I think there was a certain domestic constituency that helped him arrive at that place. So good questions. Please keep the questions coming. In 2008, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir. For originally, the prosecutor wanted 3 charges: genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The International Criminal Court decided to issue arrest warrants for just war crimes and crimes against humanity. And this is the first time that a sitting president has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for these sorts of offenses, for any sort of offenses. It's had, however, a relatively limited impact on the conflict and on the level of atrocity. Just a few examples of the way it's kind of on the margins. In July of this year, Bashir arrived in Nigeria to attend the African Union Summit and left 24 hours after he arrived because of rumors that he was about to be arrested. So it indicates that there's some restrictions on some of his movement. In an effort to go to Iran, he was blocked from entering Saudi Arabian airspace. And just last month, as some of you may know, he canceled his appearance at the General Assembly, which is to take place in New York. And there's some talk that he again feared of his arrest. So there's some limitations on his latitude for maneuver. So this is just a sort of an opening case, and what I'd ask us to think about now is, whether there's something special about these kinds of atrocities, about these kinds of conflict. Is there something special about genocide? And what do I mean by it? There are between 500 and 800,000 malaria deaths every year. And on a side note, I've had malaria. I've had it twice, actually. Between 500 and 800,000, some estimates put it as high as 1 million people die every year of malaria. The first time I contracted it was in Senegal, and I had just come out of the bush. I was back in Dakar, and I came down with the symptoms. I called the sort of toll-free number. A doctor came to my hotel, diagnosed me with malaria, wrote a script. Young kid from the hotel made a quick trip to a pharmacy a few blocks away, brought my stuff back. And I went from feeling as bad as I can ever remember feeling, as if someone had beat me with a hammer, to feeling pretty fine in about 36 hours. That whole thing cost me about $45. The doctor's visit to the hotel, the drugs, all of that, for about $45. And upwards of 1 million people die every year for want of $40 or so. There's an enormous political economy lesson there. And some have asked then, why do we give the attention to atrocity crimes like Darfur and the Congo when so many more people die of malaria? Upwards of 2 million people die every year of HIV, AIDS, and many within the African context. And from hunger and hunger-related illnesses, upwards of 7.6 million die on a yearly basis. So why am I here talking about atrocity crimes? Why am I talking about war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide? Well, Nicholas Kristof answered this question in a way that I think resonates with me. He's written a lot about Darfur, and some of you may know if you read the New York Times. And he said this, and you've got it before you, but he says, I tilt obsessively at the windmills of Darfur because quite simply its people haunt me. The young woman who deliberately made a diversion of herself so that the Janjaweed would gang rape her and miss her little sister running in the opposite direction. The man whose eyes were gouged out with a bayonet. The group of women beaten with their own babies until the children were dead. Yes, indeed, genocide truly is that bad. So I would offer that our conversation is justifiable on a number of grounds. No one should go this way. No one should suffer these kinds of indignities and these kinds of deaths. I don't want to say, however, in doing so and focusing on this, that there aren't these other crises that are of enormous importance and merit our attention, like fighting extreme poverty. And indeed, Darfur is hardly the only crisis or population facing danger today. We all know of what's going on in Syria. The death toll in Syria passed 110,000 last month. I suggested earlier that Darfur was far from the worst conflict. The worst one goes to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where more than 5 million people have perished in 2 civil wars since the late 1990s. That makes it the deadliest conflict in the world since World War II. Okay, Sudan of Darfur. There are ethnic tensions exploding in Burma or Myanmar. Populations in South Sudan face the threat of genocide. Mass killings in Egypt, 3 mass killings in Egypt threaten to bring it over the abyss. The Central African Republic, a country in neighboring Congo and some of the others, now threaten to follow what happened to Somalia in terms of state collapse. And Nigeria has an enormous problem facing a north-south division. Guinea in West Africa, and Iraq, of course. What I might say is that the list of possible sites of intervention is long indeed, and that raises a number of important questions for us. So, are there any other questions? Please, again, if you can raise your hand or chat in, please feel free to do so. This brings us to a separate question, and that kind of an a priori question, one that might have been asked from the very beginning. And it deals with what I say here is the moral relevance of distance, or the ethics of humanitarian intervention. The question is simple. This picture is an image of a child presumably drowning. And the ethical question on the table, when it comes to this business of saving strangers, is, do we have to care? Are we obligated to care about that drowning child? Is there something that obligates us to act in any particular way? If there is, then we ought to proceed in those terms. If there's not, then we can perhaps turn a blind eye to some of these atrocities if there's no obligation. So this is a classic ethical question, and it gets to the heart of the humanitarian intervention discourse. An answer to the question, is there an obligation to care? Ethicist Peter Singer said in 1972 unequivocally, yes. He was looking at the Bengal catastrophe that we might talk about a little later. But he argues quite simply that he begins with an assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. And that's a sort of starting point. And he actually asks us if we're on board with that. Because if we're not on board with that, then essentially we occupy different moral universes, and then we really don't have much to say that we can sort of dispense with the conversation. If we can't all agree that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. So that's his starting point. His second point is this, that if it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. That's his simple argument. Right? First, suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad, and he extends that argument later in 2004 to talk about places like Darfur. And secondly, if we can do something about it, and it doesn't come at some significant sacrifice on our part, then we ought to morally do it. It's as simple as that. Right? The reality, however, is that the simplicity of Singer's principle is quite deceptive. It has enormous implications for us. Right? For one, it takes no account of distance. There is no difference between a child drowning in my neighbor's pool or a child drowning or being beaten to death 6,000 miles away in Darfur. There is no moral relevance to the distance of the suffering. And that's a significant conclusion or implication of Singer's principles, because it leads us to broaden our scope of empathy extraordinarily. The moral obligation to act is the same. If we can act to save a child, we ought morally to do so. Secondly, the presence of others who might act to help save a child does nothing to diminish my own personal obligation to act in order to save the drowning child. Now, there may be psychological reasons why I don't act. I might sort of believe that others around me will act, but that does nothing about the moral obligation that I have to act if I'm in the presence or I have the capacity to do so. So Singer's principle is pretty powerful, and it leads us to some pretty significant places. Others have different ideas. Some of my students out there in the audience today remember me talking about Samuel Huntington on a number of occasions. He actually said in 1992 regarding Somalia that it was morally unjustifiable, politically indefensible, that members of the United States Armed Forces should be sent off and killed and to prevent Somalis from killing one. This was the middle of the Somali conflict-induced famine. And he speaks for a lot of people, actually. I mean, he really does sort of make a powerful argument that states have an obligation to protect their own people first, so that it doesn't make sense to send soldiers to faraway lands to save people from themselves. An ethicist by the name John Arthur articulated this in direct response to Singer's earlier principles, and he rejected what he called Singer's greater moral evil principle. What he meant by this, right, was that an ideal moral code, unlike the one that Singer articulates, would also emphasize our own entitlements, our own rights to preserve and utilize our own earnings, and that right to preserve our earnings is at least of equal significance or value to Singer's obligation to save distant strangers. So Arthur rejects sort of Singer's principles. Right? He argues that a more modest proposal would require that people help strangers when there's no substantial cost to themselves. And that's a very different moral universe than the one Singer is occupying. What does this mean for someplace like Darfur? Well, I think Singer's proposition leads us to the conclusion that we've got a moral obligation to act in any way we can without sacrificing something enormously significant to us to help save the people of Darfur. We are morally obligated to do so. And because we're morally obligated to do so, because it's a moral obligation, we can be criticized for failing to act. That's the way I read Singer. I read Arthur to mean that the obligation to Darfur is rather minimal, since in order to perhaps bring an end to the killing, we might have to expend, in the language of humanitarian intervention, considerable blood and treasure. And that would violate Singer's ideal moral code, that we're obligated to save others unless it comes at considerable expense to ourselves. So where you stand on this, where you think we ought to be, if the world failed Rwanda, if it's failing Darfur, if it's failing Congo today, the answer that you come up with, has something to do with your own moral code, sort of where you stand between Singer and Arthur, if you stand somewhere between those two places. So let me ask at this point if there's a question. I'm going to see if anyone raises their hand or oh, we do. I think we have a couple. Two have just come in, right? Amy Keister. Hi, Amy. We talked about this in class, did we not? You've asked, how are we meant to apply these propositions in the context in which so many Americans simply aren't aware of these instances of mass human suffering? Wow. Yeah. You know, that's a really tough question, Amy. I think that in the case of Darfur, actually, I'm going to speak to Rwanda. In some sense, the obligation might fall on political actors first. So when Rwanda was exploding in 1994, in spring of 1994, the Clinton administration did relatively little about it. In fact, they acted in ways counter to acting. They actually took positive steps to prevent others from intervening. And the big question at the time was, or subsequently, is what did they know and when did they know it? It's hard to support the proposition that the administration didn't have fairly early on, pretty reliable information coming from the French press, in particular the Francophone press, that atrocities of enormous scale were taking place. So I think the obligation, one way I read your question, Amy, is that the obligation falls on those who do have this information. And our political leaders are obviously those who are most likely to have this information. And I think the Clinton administration failed the Rwandan people, as does President Clinton today. He subsequently apologized for his own failings in the Rwandan genocide. So that's a tough question. I think there is woeful ignorance of many sites of atrocity, but I think that's less true at the level of those who have the capacity to act with authority. So thank you, Amy. It's lovely to have you here with us tonight. I have Kendra Horman who's asking, does it seem to a certain level that atrocious acts against humanity are also dependent on the wealth of a country or a group of people? Let me see. I'll read that again. Does it seem to a certain level that atrocious acts against humanity are also dependent on the wealth of a country or a group of people? I'm not quite certain what this is asking. If you could perhaps reformulate, what I think you might be saying is, well, I think my answer to that may be perhaps no. Right?
If she has another one.
Oh yes. Okay. That is to say, thanks. That is to say, an atrocious act may be potentially be referred to as such if stemming from a first world versus a third world country. I see. I think if I understand this correctly, one of the things I learned about, what I'd say to this, and I don't know if this is actually getting to your question, but one of the things I learned pretty early on in studying atrocity was pretty frightening. Actually, and that's that it seems to be truly a part of the human condition. Genocide, mass atrocity, is an old story. It's biblical, as we perhaps all know. It's occurred in every corner of the world. It's happened in every time, so it's not just biblical, but it's contemporary news. It's happened in North America with the Native Americans. It's happened in Latin and Central America. It's happened in the heart of Europe. It's happened in Africa. And it's happened in the killing fields of Cambodia and Asia. It has happened in every corner of the world in all times. And what that seems to suggest to me, as I say, is frightening. It's a part of the human condition. I'll give you a little story on this. I spent the year 1990-91 studying in southern France at the University of Montpellier. And I made a very good friend with a Rwandan. We spent many a night up late, drinking good French wine, talking about African affairs and African politics. And it was the middle of the first Gulf War. We discussed those events. And several years ago, I found his gift to me at the end of the year on my bookshelf. It was a book about Rwanda. And I hadn't seen it in years, and I pulled it off the shelf. Saw his name, and it brought back some lovely memories. And then I quickly wondered what had happened to him. I wondered if they had started compiling victims' names, as they have done, say, for the Holocaust. So I went Googling. I went to go see if I could find my friend. And the reality is that I did find him. But he was no victim of genocide. He was an active participant. He was a génocidaire. He was a key element of radio television mille collines that helped orchestrate the mass murder. And I was just, as you might imagine, shocked to the core. This was my friend. We had great concern for each other, and we had the love of good friends. And it turned out that this person I cared so much for, believed I knew pretty well, and I do think I know him well, is also capable of committing atrocities such as genocide. So I don't know if that helps answer your question, but I think these are sort of context and wealth independent. I think these have happened all over the world and in all times. And that does, in fact, frighten me, because it suggests, at the end of the day, that we might all be capable of it. And that's truly, truly frightening. I've got a question from Paramita Sen. Hi, Paramita. It's nice to have you with us. How do you convince those only interested in geopolitical interests to intervene in a genocide occurring in a country of little importance? Well, that's a great question, Paramita. Where I'm going to take this, if we have the time, is to talk about some new developments in the arena, in the normative arena, known as the responsibility to protect. And the idea, I think the point I would make is that we are making progress on this front. We've seen intervention by the international community in some spaces that haven't really mattered all that much. And in fact, I would even suggest that the first President Bush, when he intervened in Somalia, although it went very, very badly, and I've studied this case quite a bit, actually, and I've come to the conclusion that there was no immediate political benefit to the President for intervening, or for the country for that matter. Somalia had lost its geostrategic importance with the end of the Cold War, and technology had made some of the tracking stations that were there in Somalia sort of redundant. He had already lost re-election, so he had nothing to gain by going. I really do think we involved ourselves in Somalia for some pretty decent reasons, and I don't think that's the only one. I wish I could say that we're prepared to act more frequently than we are, whenever mass atrocity crimes are committed. But I think we've seen some progress in this area also in recent years under the responsibility to protect doctrine, which we'll get to in a little bit. But at the end of the day, Paramita, I think you know well that that geopolitics matters, and it will always be something that we have to confront. So thank you. I think we've got some more questions. Catherine Richter is asking, if you're coming to this later, please feel free to hold, but do any of these individuals write about the obligation to intervene in light of conflicts potentially resulting from years of colonialism? That's not coming up so much, actually. That's a sort of, academically, a kind of unpopular position to hold the farther we get from the end of the colonial period. And so I actually have asked what the international responsibility to protect means if part of the explanation for the conflicts into which we intervene might be of some of our own making. And I would actually suggest there is an exception to my earlier point. Anne Orford, an international legal scholar in Australia, has written about this very question, about the culpability of Western powers in creating some of the very sites of atrocity that we then kind of heroically go intervening in. So I think there is some conversation about that, but less so than there might have been, say, 15 or 20 years ago, when colonialism as a factor was sort of more sort of understood or debated. Okay, and then Art Nevins has asked, do you think the American public at this time supports Singer's proposition or Arthur's? Yeah. I think we're all over the place. I really do. I think there are those who take Huntington's and Arthur's position and hold, and I don't think that this is an unreasonable proposition, right? That states, the very social contract that come to constitute sovereign states, really do have an obligation to protect their own people. I think that's sort of the essence of a social contract. However, I do think that there are those, and I'm in that camp as well, that find we are obligated to act when it is within our power to do so. So I reject Huntington's proposition that that it's morally untenable to send troops into harm's way. Because I don't think Huntington would have thought it was untenable to send American troops into harm's way to keep Europeans from killing each other during World War II, for example. So, so I think your question's really interesting. I think we're all over the map on this, and I think that's one explanation for why we get such varied responses from different circumstances. Why we intervene in some places and not in others, because I think we're sort of schizophrenic about this question. So, so yeah. And Ashley Isaac, nice to have you with us. Ashley asks, how do you define progress with humanitarian intervention? Great. If so, how and what do we measure, especially if the numbers are increasing, about 4 million displaced in Darfur? Yeah, wow, great question, actually. When I say we're making some progress, what I should say is that the international community is making some progress in the normative arena. We are the international legal architecture is starting to change and reflect some of the principles of say Singer's propositions. The international responsibility to protect, in some sense, reflects a Singer's sort of place, maybe not quite to the extreme that Singer would take it. So the advance of R2P, which I'll talk about if we have time, is for me the kind of progress I'm referring to in the sort of normative arena. And we can look at some examples of intervening in Kenya, in Cote d'Ivoire, and perhaps even Libya as examples of having acted in ways that prevented mass-scale human suffering. So that's the kind of thing I'm sort of thinking about. So I'm going to actually ask how we're doing on time. We started at the top of the hour. Yeah, so I'm going to take us another 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do actually is I prepared way too many slides, more than I can possibly do. Oh, don't hit that button. I'm going to jump to, I want us to talk about Syria, actually. And let's see if I can do this in a few minutes. What I'm not going to talk about is some of the legal and normative concepts like sovereignty and some of those things. Let's see. Nope. I can't seem to get it. I'm going to have to move it this way. I'm sorry. If you'll just bear with me, I'm just going to advance through a number of quick slides to get where I want us to talk about Syria, because I think a number of you have that on your mind. And this is a case where we can start answering some of your questions like yours, Ashley. Is there a responsibility to protect the people of Syria? Well, a very brief story, or very brief history. The end of the Cold War ushered in a new era in world affairs. Right? It brought about an end to some thinking about the importance of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, sovereignty as we call it. If we had had time, I'd have taken you through some of that. Right? It brought an end to some of the supremacy of thinking about non-intervention in classical sovereignty. And that's true for a number of reasons. One is that the 1990s was an incredibly violent and very confused time. We saw a major spike in civil wars. And so all of a sudden, instead of this great peace dividend that was to come at the end of the Cold War, we saw more civil war, more death, more dying, and in horribly destructive ways. Right? So we saw this major spike in civil wars. Right? And we also, at the time, perhaps as a result, a response to that, we saw a major escalation in the United Nations' involvement in peacekeeping. And their missions became incredibly complex. It has been said that they were often sent to keep peaces that didn't exist. Right? They sent the wrong kinds of forces. Right? This time was also a very contradictory and a time of confused engagement with these affairs. And what I mean by that, right, is the decade opened with some decisions to intervene, like in the civil war in Liberia, but we did so rather ineffectual, sort of limited forces and rather ineffective. We did intervene in Somalia. We decided actually that famine was an international threat to peace and security, so we intervened in Somalia. Right? But we were quite late to intervene in the Balkans, right? And when we did so, rather half-heartedly, right, allowing acts of genocide like that, which took place in the town of Srebrenica, when 8,000 Muslim men and boys were slaughtered under the very eyes of the United Nations. We did not act in Rwanda, even though we had acted, even though the death scale, the total death was far beyond what we saw in Somalia. We decided not to act there. Right? At the end of the decade, we decided to act in Kosovo, right? But we did so without what's called Security Council authorization. And under the United Nations system, under international law, that made that intervention unlawful. But subsequently, an international commission of jurists found that though it was unlawful, it was legitimate because of the ethnic cleansing that was taking place. So the point here is that the 90s was a time of enormous confusion about what the basic rules were in international affairs with respect to intervening into these sites of mass atrocity, mass human suffering. So I think there was a real clamoring for some sort of new thinking. Right? Secretary General Kofi Annan at the end of the 90s, in 1999, threw down the gauntlet, as I suggest, and he asked this question. He said to the United Nations, if humanitarian intervention is indeed an unacceptable assault on sovereignty, how should we respond to a Rwanda, to a Srebrenica, to gross and systematic violations of human rights that affect every precept of our common humanity? We were starting to see some conflict of ideas coming to a head here. And Kofi Annan really did sort of lead the charge here. As a result of that, we started to see some new ideas emerge. And one in particular came out of an international commission known as the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty. And the report, and the idea is the report of the same name. And that's the responsibility to protect. And what I want to do in the last, say, 10 or 15 minutes is to take you through this a little bit and see how it applies to the case of Syria. It has been said that R2P is an enormously successful idea. No idea has moved faster, farther in the normative arena than R2P, say perhaps the Genocide Convention. Right? So it's very, very significant. Right? From 2001, just 4 years later, in 2005, the international community came together at the World Summit and enshrined some of the basic principles of that R2 report into international law. Paragraphs 138 and 139 in particular of the World Summit Outcome Document enshrine some of the basic ideas of the responsibility to protect. Right? It is said that there are 3 pillars to the R2P. Right? And this is to quote Kofi Annan, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who says the first pillar of R2P is the enduring responsibility of states to protect their own people. So the first sovereignty idea is that states have a responsibility to protect their own people. That's an element of state sovereignty, this responsibility. The second pillar is that the international community has a responsibility to help states carry out that sovereign responsibility. That may come in the form of development assistance, may come in all kinds of ways. And then thirdly, the international community is the responsibility of member states, meaning members of the United Nations, to respond in a collectively in a timely and decisive manner when a state is manifestly failing in its first pillar. When a state fails to provide the kind of protection to its people that the first pillar demands of it, then that sovereign responsibility transfers to the international community, and the international community has a responsibility to act, to intervene, to save those people the state seems incapable or unwilling to save. This is the essence of the responsibility to protect doctrine. So, should we intervene in Syria, given the enormous enormity of the crisis, 110,000 dead? Well, as you know, as you probably all know, we failed to act in any significant way until a chemical weapons attack killed about 1,000 people. The numbers vary between 300 and 1,000 people. And then President Obama declared that he was going to strike Syria with military force in response to that violation of the chemical weapons taboo. So the question is, does this fit R2P? Is this an appropriate use of R2P? And this is what I kind of want to take us through here, just see how it goes. Well, the original, there's more to sort of the equation than just those 3 pillars. The thinking behind responsibility to protect kind of comes out of the just war tradition, if you're familiar with some of that, right? So the first thing is that there has to be a just cause in order to intervene. And what that means, coming out of the ICAS report, is that there has to be large-scale loss of life, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that absolutely, right, in the case of Syria, right, the just cause criterion is met. Right? We've got another question coming up. Right? Jeffrey Schindler
right? How does the use of chemical weapons change the nature, or how should we think about humanitarian intervention? I think that's exactly the question on the table here, is does it in fact at all change the equation, right? And I think I'm going to answer it in some ways. I don't think it did change the equation. And if I don't answer your question, just kind of send in another one and we'll see if we can't get to it. But I'm going to sort of take this on. So just cause in Syria, I think absolutely. Right? As I said, the death toll passed 110,000. I'll make this PowerPoint available. You can follow the link here, which will take you to a map of the humanitarian scale, humanitarian crisis. So just cause seems to be met. What about this issue of right intention in terms of the criteria for military intervention? Well, the right intention criterion says that the primary purpose of intervention must be to halt or avert human suffering. But if we're referring to President Obama's plan to strike Syria for its chemical weapons violation, then we have to say that this is not, in fact, consistent with the right intention, because President Obama was pretty clear about this, that his plan to strike Syria was not about changing the equation of the conflict. It was not about bringing an end to the conflict. It was about punishing the regime for its use of chemical weapons. That's a very different idea. So the stated intention was violating a norm and not to end the suffering that the right intention sort of requires, right? I've got another comment here from Henry Dambanamouya. Hello, Henry. Great question from Ashley. Anyway, my question is, if there is a responsibility to protect, at what point does one take up the responsibility, and what does that responsibility entail, right? From whence does the responsibility originate, and what, if any, are the limits to R2P? Let's see, Henry, if we get to this in time. I think because those are the very questions that I'm wrestling with in my own thinking and in the book. And I think some of the R2P comes out of the just war tradition. I think some of it comes out of what happened in the 90s. What it means for any individual case is really difficult to determine. So let's see if we have time to get to those questions, Henry, because they're the ones that animate my work most directly. So I don't think that the right criteria, the right intention criterion, is satisfied by President Obama's intention to strike Syria. It's not about civilian protection, it's about punishment. A third criterion for military intervention is known as last resort. Pretty self-explanatory. But this is sort of tricky, right? The basic idea is that every diplomatic or non-military avenue for the prevention or peaceful resolution of humanitarian crisis needs to be exhausted. Well, this is always, how do you know when, in fact, all the reasonable efforts have been exhausted? And if you wait for the last, you may, in fact, watch genocide happen as you wait to exhaust all the diplomatic options. So this is a really tricky one. I find it's one of the most complicated to apply. And so I'll say something about that. At one level, the Assad regime now sees that we've reached a stalemate. His deputy prime minister argued that the conflict has reached a stalemate. And what that means, actually, is something positive. Because in conflict theory, we often know that external intervention to bring about conflict mediation rarely happens outside a hurting stalemate, when both parties to the conflict finally come to believe that there's no military solution. So if we are arriving at some stalemate in this conflict, we may actually be arriving at a moment when external intervention of a mediatory sort, of kind of conflict transformation sort, might actually have some effect. Laura Pierce is asking, couldn't you argue that the choice to intervene in Syria would be right intervention because it would avert future human suffering in other countries, this being based on the sort of setting the precedent idea? I think that's absolutely possible. And I think that's part of President Obama's thinking, right? Is that at least with respect to suffering caused by chemical weapons, by showing that there's a cost to using chemical weapons. But I'm not sure punishing the regime for its use of chemical weapons does much to prevent future suffering from conventional weapons. And the reality in Syria is that 110,000 dead have died largely from conventional weapons. So I think you're absolutely right that the thinking of the Obama administration is that punishing the norm violation, the taboo on chemical weapons, is about preventing it from happening again. I think there's something there for sure. but I don't think it necessarily sets a precedent that would prevent other forms of atrocity committed with, I mean, if you think about it, Rwanda was committed with machetes. So it's sort of tricky. How do we do on time? We've just got a few minutes left. So proportional means, right? The last one of the last criterions is that the scale, duration, and intensity of the planned military intervention should be the minimum necessary to achieve the objective. This is interesting when it comes to President Obama's plan, because it's not clear there's any discernible impact actually on the whole humanitarian crisis. Again, it's about punishing the regime. Right? This might be an argument actually for a greater level of military intervention, and Laura, you might sort of be in that camp. John McCain's in that camp, actually. He opposed the president's limited strike because he wanted to see a larger scale intervention to help bring about an end to the conflict and the suffering itself. So proportional means is a tricky one. And then lastly, there have to be reasonable prospects of success. There has to be a reasonable chance of actually achieving success in your effort to bring about an end to the humanitarian crisis. If you can't, if you don't believe you can achieve your objective, it would be ethically inappropriate to send soldiers into harm's way if they've got a sort of no-win proposition in front of them. So reasonable prospects need to be there, and I think the Syria conflict is so complex and so deeply divided now as the opposition fractures, and that it's not clear military intervention. It's not clear to me that there's a military solution to the Syrian conflict. Lastly, sorry, I said that was the last one is right authority. Now, the Security Council has to authorize if it's going to be legal, right? And clearly we don't have Security Council authorization to do so. Russia and China are opposing any effort on that front. So where does this leave us? Well, I think in favor of the president's proposal, there is just cause. I mean, I think the atrocities in Syria are of such scale that absolutely the just cause criterion is met. And I actually believe that we haven't missed any diplomatic opportunities. I think the last resort sort of criterion may well be met. It's always hard to know exactly. But I think stacked against his proposal are the right intention, proportional means, reasonable prospects, and right authority dimensions. I just don't think those are satisfied in his proposal. So that leaves us, right, with some concluding reflections, which is simply, sadly, there's no shortage of sites of possible intervention. I've given you the list before. It's long and it's getting longer all the time. With the Genocide Convention, we said we'd never allow we'd never allow a Holocaust to happen again. Right? But China under Mao, some 50 million people died. Nearly 2 million died in the killing fields of Cambodia. 150,000 died under Mengistu, the Derg regime of Ethiopia in the 70s. The Biafran War killed 1 million people using food as a weapon. 800,000 died in Rwanda. Somewhere upwards of 500,000 died under Idi Amin's regime in Uganda. And now in Syria, over 110,000 have died. We've said never again, and we failed to keep that promise again and again and again. We have made some progress, and I think the responsibility to protect doctrine is moving us in that direction. I'm afraid we've sort of come to the time. I want to leave some time for some questions, some more questions, but I think we've made some progress in the normative arena with the responsibility to protect, but much more progress remains to be made, indeed. So thank you, and let's see if we can open this floor. Yes, we've got some more questions. So great. So let's see what we've got. Matthew Stone is asking, can you justify that the punishment for chemical weapons would discourage further use, potentially then averting human suffering? Yeah, sort of as I was saying, I think punishing the chemical weapons taboo, the chemical weapons norm, might in fact prevent future chemical weapons use by other parties. I absolutely think that's the case. If we demonstrate that there's a cost to using them, then the human suffering caused by chemical weapons might be alleviated. But as I was saying earlier, the sad, stark reality of the Syrian conflict is 9,000 people have died through conventional weapons, and this will do nothing to stop that number from growing. So I find that strike sort of unhelpful or less than fully effective. And I'm sort of on Singer's end of things, if you want. And I actually, just full disclosure, I voted twice for President Obama. I just think his position on this was wrong. So we've got Jacob Krause who's asking, in your opinion, would right intention have been met if President Obama instead said the attacks were to remove the capability of the Assad regime to use chemical weapons to commit these atrocities? Well, in fact, I think that's what he was saying, right? Is that he was going to degrade the capacity to use chemical weapons further. But what he wasn't saying was that this was intended to tip the balance in the conflict in such a way as it might bring it to an end. In fact, he assiduously avoided saying things like that. Well, no, to be honest, he said exactly the opposite. He said this is not intended to tip the balance. So I think that leaves the right intention sort of in abeyance in that sense. Very good question. Kendra, again, asks, how does one distinguish between civil war and genocide? Ooh, that's a great question. Or predetermining a situation which may result in atrocity, especially given that civil war implicates that the state's people are not as a whole protected. And if the U.S. is viewed as the world police, as the term has been tossed about, what does that mean for our responsibility with as individuals and as a country? These are great questions, Kendra. Someone in the audience, Henry Dunbonamuya, is working on some of these things. He was my student last year, graduated last year. He's working for Genocide Prevention, the Sentinel Project, and it's really difficult. I've recently done some work on early warning systems, some recent academic work on early warning systems. But I have to say that though it was published in a journal that deals with the responsibility to protect, I really felt that my work was better at detecting when conflict itself was going to come up, not necessarily conflict associated with mass atrocity crimes, or crimes associated with responsibility to protect, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing. I think it's really, really complicated. I think the business about the world's police is often exaggerated when it comes to the United States. If you look at the sort of composition of the peacekeeping forces out there in the world today, the U.S. really doesn't amount to very much in it. We may help provide some of the resources for it. We fund a great deal of that. But in terms of the soldiers on the ground in some of these in these peacekeeping forces, as I said today, the 3 killed today in Darfur were from Senegal. And I think that's generally the case, that most of the composition of these peacekeeping forces is generally not European, not Western. Maybe Canada, maybe Ireland, with some 2 exceptions. Matthew Stone has a question. If all these terrible things have been allowed, what does it take to actually classify a genocide? Well, the Genocide Convention is kind of clear about that. It simply means, and I should probably have my iPad here and help me look up and get the terms exactly right. But basically what the Genocide Convention states is that the intended effort to annihilate a people in whole or in part, based on ethnic, religious grounds, those kinds of things. So it actually doesn't say anything about scale, which is interesting, because that's why genocide's been documented in Latin America with the slaughter of tens of thousands rather than hundreds or millions, because of the size of the populations, Native Indigenous Americans, that were under attack. So it's less about scale than the effort to annihilate in whole or in part a people based on identity, like ethnicity, religion, culture, or what have you. So. Okay, and then I think we have one more question from Art Nevins. Attacking chemical weapons brings the likelihood of doing more damage to the population. I think that's right. I think one concern I had with the strike was that anytime you use modern weaponry, one of the great ethical debates, I didn't bring it up today because we just didn't have time to go there, but one of the great ethical debates about humanitarian intervention is it okay to use military power for humanitarian purposes at all? The Kosovo intervention gave us the term humanitarian bombing, which strikes some as oxymoronic. You will have what they call collateral damage. You will kill innocents. And the ethical question, the ethical dilemma is it okay to kill innocent civilians in the effort to protect these other innocent civilians? And for me, part of the right intention has to be that you're trying to prevent a larger scale atrocity from continuing or occurring. And so you may, in fact, be ethical in the killing of civilians if in doing so you prevent the slaughter of a great deal more of innocent civilians. But I don't think that would be the case in the Syrian intervention. So that your question gets right back to the heart of ethics of humanitarian intervention and the use of military power for humanitarian purposes. So yeah, excellent question. We have so many more questions. Do we have? Can we? Yeah, sure. No, we can take them on. This is great. So, and I know some of you need to come and go as you need to. So, Ashley Isaac wanted to know why I didn't teach the senior seminar on this. Different department, but I offered the class and you didn't take it because I think you had to take something else. So it was been good to have you in there. But I'll see you in Baltimore next month at the conference and we can talk more about this stuff. Jacob Krause again says, how does R2P grapple with the potential of a legal intervention being blocked by vetoes in the Security Council? Where does the morality override legal concerns, or does it? This is exactly right. There are two versions of R2P, I should say. The first one is that report I talked about that was issued in 2001. And so the original vision of the R2P was that if the Security Council was blocked, as it is in Syria, in the case of Syria, the regional organizations like, say, the Arab League or the African Union could act without Security Council authorization, and then perhaps get subsequent ex post facto authorization from the Security Council if need be. So the original version of R2P sort of held out the possibility of acting without the Security Council. But the version that was signed at the World Summit Outcome document in 2005 clearly stipulates that the Security Council will authorize this intervention, and that's the law. That's the version of R2P that made it that is a part of the international legal architecture, and so it does override morality in that sense. Pardon me. You know what? But I wouldn't be the first to point that out. That what's moral and what's legal are not the same thing. Any lawyer could tell you the same thing, that often what's legal and what's appropriate and ethical and moral terms are inconsistent. So you've nailed that. As long as the Security Council has to be the authorizing agent, as long as we're going to be acting in terms consistent with international law, then we may fail to act on our moral obligation. And that gets to the heart of some of these dilemmas of humanitarian intervention. So thank you, Jacob. Kelly Stone, nice to have you with us, Kelly. Kelly asks, you were still talking about the President's proposal in the lens of humanitarian intervention, but while the language of protecting humans was frequently referenced, he was clearly focused on international law related to chemical weapons. That's right, and not anything to do with human suffering per se. You're absolutely right, Kelly. I sort of conflate a few things there. What I was trying to do was to get us to talk about R2P in the only terms present, in terms of the only kind of intervention on the table, because there's just nothing larger on the table than that limited strike. But you're absolutely right. So what I was trying to do was look at the one proposal on the table through the R2P lens. But the reality is that the international community at the Security Council level is deadlocked, and so there is no greater proposal on the table. So yeah, touche. Great observation. Absolutely. Elizabeth Masoff, and your new last name is hyphenated. It's not. I can't see it all, but I know that you just got married, and I'm so excited for you. She asks, trying to address and bring relief to human rights violations, among the worst, genocides, by means of military action through political processes, is rather like attempting to ride a scooter on a gravel road. What alternatives, aid opportunities, yield relative successes? Where does microfinance fall? As part of this conversation is necessarily about prevention. You're absolutely right. Being proactive rather than reactive. What fringe organizations do you see being more effective at providing aid and empowering civilians in various regions to maintain functioning society from within? You couldn't be more right. And that's where my research is now. That's why I'm interested in conflict early warning. Prevention is the principal element of the responsibility to protect. The Secretary General has issued a report on R2P every year for the past 5 years. And in every one it is reiterated that prevention is the most important dimension of R2P. That's where the scholarship is for the most part. Well, that's not exactly true. There's a lot of interest in the kind of logistics of intervention and those sort of things. The very idea of economic development bringing security is an important part of this conversation. Is what's known as the security development nexus. What that simply means is that you can't expect, there's a sort of, this is a very tough nut to crack, but what it means is you can't expect good security, good secure conditions in a developing country without an adequate level of economic development, unless people's basic human needs are met. But you can't expect an adequate level of economic development in the absence of good security. Both of these things need to be present, but they work at odds against each other. Their absence works at odds. So that's the dilemma of the development security nexus that people are trying to wrestle with today. But you're absolutely right that so much of what we need to be thinking about goes far beyond. And if I've left people with the impression that R2P is about military intervention, I've done it a disservice, because so much of the toolbox for R2P has nothing to do with military intervention. It has to do with sending in mediators and all economic development assistance and all of that kind of stuff. It's a big toolbox, and military stuff is but one instrument in that toolbox. So thank you for bringing that out, because I should have made that point clearer. Amy Keister again, has there been any discussion of applying the principles behind R2P to mass human suffering caused not by physical violence, crimes against humanity, but instead caused by political and legislative realities? For example, mass hunger as a result of laws that effectively keep the poor poor. Or environmental degradation that causes conflict, that kills people. There's very little of that in this R2P discourse. I asked the special representative of the Secretary General this very question several years ago in New York. I asked if the responsibility to protect and to prevent conflict was going to take account of the impact of global climate change on things like desertification that's giving rise to conflicts like Darfur. You can't understand the conflict in Darfur without understanding desertification driven by climate change. The ground under herders and farmers failed, and it switched symbiotic relationships into genocidal ones. I mean, there's more to it than that. The government of Khartoum has a great deal of responsibility, but there's a big element of that. So I asked Ed Luck, the special representative for the Secretary General on R2P, if we were going to start considering these things, and he said absolutely unequivocally, no, we're not. For him, he wants to keep it narrow so that we can make progress on the 4 atrocity crimes associated with the R2P: genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So they've very much narrowed this thing from the original R2P report in 2001 to exclude things like death from poverty. In 2008, Cyclone Nargis hit Burma, and hundreds of thousands of people were dying because the country of Burma didn't have the capacity to respond. And many argued this is an R2P situation. There was a U.S. naval vessel right off the coast that could have provided enormous assistance, and Burma wouldn't allow it to do so. And some argued this is an R2P situation. It's mass human suffering. The state's incapable of dealing with it. Let's intervene. But it's been narrowly tailored. The version of the R2P that passed the World Summit in 2005 excludes those kinds of things. And for someone like me, I think that's unfortunate. And I think you're with me on that, Amy, if I remember you well enough. And I think I do. So thank you. And Kelly Stone asks, do you think if he had more clearly separated what he was proposing for humanitarian intervention and why, he may have received more support either at home or internationally? I suppose you mean President Obama. I'm not sure. I think Americans are really really gun shy at the moment, given a decade of conflict starting with the Iraq War. I think and this is unusual because Americans are pretty quick to rally around the flag, as you well know. But I think that was an uphill battle from the get-go. Even though the imagery of the chemical weapons attack, I mean, was just horrific. The imagery of the children was particularly moving to Americans, as it was to this father. And yet I think there was this sense that And I don't actually believe this. I think many Americans thought this attack would lead to a greater involvement in the war, and I don't actually believe that. I believe he could have struck, hit those 53 targets that had something to do with chemical weapons, and just left it at that. I don't think it was going to lead to a domino or a slippery slope into greater involvement in the war. I'm not one who believes that. I think many Americans do, though, however, and as a result, they're sort of hands off. Something's happened here. I've lost the questions. Ah, okay. So I think we may have come to the end. Well, let me thank everyone for your participation, your attendance. This went better than I could have imagined. I didn't do all my slides, but I didn't think I would anyway. So thank you, and thanks to my colleagues for their help making this possible. And I wish you well. Oh, and please look me up on the website, the Political Science Department. If you've got questions you want to follow up on this, do send me an email. You might put in the subject line something about humanitarian intervention webinar. I think I have 400 unopened email at present. So if you want me to answer them, you might want to make it clear that you're about this, and I'll be happy to get back to you. Thanks very much, everyone, and I wish you a good night.